By the time American soldiers waded ashore on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, the outcome of the war in Europe would hinge not only on tanks, aircraft, or grand strategy, but on a handful of weapons that could be trusted to work every time a man pulled the trigger. Among those weapons, none proved more quietly decisive than the Browning M1919. It lacked the terrifying buzzsaw sound of Germany's MG42 and never achieved the same mythic reputation. Yet from Normandy to Berlin it became the backbone of American infantry firepower, pinning down German units, breaking counterattacks, and holding ground under conditions where lesser weapons failed. The origins of the M1919 stretch back to the First World War, and the mind of John Moses Browning, arguably the most influential small arms designer in history. During World War I, Browning's water-cooled M1917 machine gun had earned an ironclad reputation for reliability and sustained fire, but it was heavy, cumbersome, and best suited to static defensive warfare. As armies studied the brutal lessons of trench combat, it became clear that future wars would demand more mobile firepower, guns that could move with advancing troops rather than anchoring them in place. The M1919 was Browning's answer to that problem. The M1919 was essentially a refined, air-cooled evolution of the M1917. By eliminating the bulky water jacket and replacing it with a perforated steel barrel shroud, Browning dramatically reduced weight while preserving the same robust internal mechanism. Chambered in the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge, the same round used by American rifles, the M1919 delivered a rate of fire between 400 and 600 rounds per minute. It was belt-fed, fed reliably by cloth or later metallic disintegrating belts, and designed to function in dirt, mud, cold, and heat with minimal maintenance. For infantrymen, these qualities mattered more than elegance or innovation. The gun simply worked. By the early years of World War II, the M1919A4 variant had become the standard American medium machine gun. Weighing roughly 31 pounds for the gun itself and another 14 pounds for its tripod, it could be carried, emplaced, and repositioned far more easily than its water-cooled predecessor. A typical crew consisted of 2 to 3 men, one gunner, one assistant gunner, and often an ammunition bearer, who together could bring devastating suppressive fire to bear on enemy positions. This was not a weapon designed for flashy individual heroics. It was a tool of coordination, discipline, and endurance. When American forces first encountered German infantry in large numbers, particularly in North Africa and later in Italy, the contrast between weapons became apparent. The German MG34 and MG42 were faster firing and highly flexible, but they were also sensitive to dirt, mud, and extreme cold. American troops quickly learned that while German machine guns could dominate an engagement when functioning perfectly, they were far more prone to jamming under sustained combat conditions. The M1919, by comparison, might not have matched the sheer cyclic rate of its German counterparts, but it kept firing when the environment turned hostile. That reliability became its greatest strength. On D-Day itself, the M1919 played a critical role even amid the chaos of the landings. While much of the early attention focused on individual rifles and submachine guns, machine gun teams were essential in establishing footholds on the beaches. As American units fought their way off the sand and into the hedgerows of Normandy, the M1919 became the anchor around which infantry maneuvered. German defenders, dug in behind earthworks, and reinforced farm buildings, relied heavily on interlocking machine gun fire to hold ground. Breaking those defenses required American machine guns to suppress, pin, and isolate enemy positions long enough for riflemen and assault teams to advance. The hedgerow country of Normandy was uniquely brutal terrain for infantry combat. Thick earthen banks topped with dense vegetation limited visibility to just a few yards and turned every field into a potential ambush. In this environment, the M1919's sustained fire capability was invaluable. Crews would emplace the gun to dominate narrow gaps, lanes, and suspected enemy approaches, pouring rounds into hedgerow openings where German troops might attempt to maneuver. The steady, hammering fire of the .30 caliber rounds forced German units to keep their heads down, disrupting coordination and buying time for American forces to reposition. As the campaign in France progressed and the Allies broke out of Normandy following Operation Cobra, the M1919 followed American forces across open countryside, towns, and river crossings. Mounted on half-tracks, jeeps, and tanks, it provided mobile firepower that could keep pace with advancing armor. On vehicles, the M1919 proved just as dependable as it did on the ground, delivering suppressive fire against infantry, soft-skinned vehicles, and defensive positions. Tank crews often relied on coaxial or pintle-mounted M1919s to clear enemy infantry threats that their main guns could not easily engage. The true test of the M1919's reputation came during the winter of 1944–45, in the frozen forests and villages of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, lubrication thickened, and weapons across both sides of the conflict began to fail. German machine guns suffered from frozen components and fouling, while American infantrymen struggled to keep rifles and automatic weapons functioning. In these conditions, the M1919 again proved its worth. With proper handling and minimal maintenance, it continued to fire reliably in snow, ice, and mud, delivering the sustained suppressive fire needed to repel German assaults. German units attacking American defensive positions during the Bulge often relied on massed infantry supported by armor. In these moments, the M1919 became the center of defensive fire plans. Crews fired thousands of rounds during prolonged engagements, cutting down advancing troops, breaking up assaults, and forcing enemy units to withdraw or seek cover. Veterans later recalled the psychological effect of the gun as much as its physical impact. The deep, rhythmic thump of the .30 caliber fire signaled that the line was holding, even when conditions seemed hopeless. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany itself, the M1919 continued to serve as the workhorse of American infantry units. In urban combat, where streets, rubble, and shattered buildings created deadly choke points, machine gun teams set up to dominate intersections and avenues of approach. German soldiers, many of them exhausted, undertrained, or equipped with dwindling resources, learned quickly to respect the weapon. Captured M1919s were sometimes pressed into German service, a testament to the gun's reliability and effectiveness even in enemy hands. By the time American troops reached the ruins of Berlin, the M1919 had earned its place as one of the most dependable weapons of the European war. It did not win battles on its own, but it enabled everything else to function: riflemen to move, tanks to advance, and defensive lines to hold under pressure. Over 500,000 were produced during the war, and countless German attacks were stalled, broken, or crushed under its sustained fire. The M1919 Browning did exactly what it was designed to do, every time it was needed, and in a war defined by chaos and uncertainty, that reliability made all the difference. As the war in Europe intensified through late 1944 and early 1945, the Browning M1919 was no longer simply a support weapon attached to infantry formations. It had become the structural spine of American small unit tactics. U.S. Army doctrine placed enormous emphasis on fire and maneuver, and at the center of that concept was the machine gun. Riflemen moved because machine gunners made movement possible. The M1919 was the weapon that allowed squads and platoons to advance across open ground, clear fortified positions, and survive encounters with well-entrenched German defenders. Unlike the German doctrine that treated the machine gun as the focal point of the squad, American doctrine distributed firepower more evenly, with the M1919 providing sustained suppressive fire at the platoon and company level. This difference mattered. While German squads relied heavily on a single machine gun whose failure could cripple an entire formation, American units could shift, reinforce, and reposition their M1919s to maintain constant pressure. The Browning's durability made this flexibility possible. Crews trusted the gun to function after being dragged through mud, snow, or rubble, and that trust translated directly into tactical confidence. One of the M1919's greatest strengths was its ability to maintain continuous fire over long engagements. The .30-06 cartridge delivered effective range and penetration that allowed crews to suppress enemy infantry well beyond rifle distance. German troops advancing under fire from an M1919 often found themselves pinned in place, unable to move without exposing themselves to lethal bursts. This suppression was not merely physical but psychological. Veterans on both sides recalled how the steady hammering of American machine guns made even hardened soldiers reluctant to lift their heads, much less organize an assault. During the push through France and into the Low Countries, the M1919 proved especially valuable in combined arms operations. Infantry advancing alongside tanks relied on machine gun teams to protect flanks, clear infantry threats, and secure newly captured ground. Mounted versions of the M1919 on half-tracks and armored vehicles extended this capability, allowing firepower to move with advancing columns. In many cases, the machine gun was the first weapon brought to bear when contact was made, buying precious seconds for commanders to assess the situation and respond. German counterattacks often came suddenly and with little warning, particularly in forested or urban terrain. In these moments, the speed with which an M1919 team could deploy was critical. Crews trained to set up the gun rapidly, establish overlapping fields of fire, and begin suppressing the enemy almost immediately. The tripod-mounted M1919, though heavier than a light machine gun, provided exceptional stability. This allowed gunners to deliver accurate fire even during long bursts, conserving ammunition while maximizing effect. The gun's reliability also allowed American units to adopt aggressive defensive tactics. Rather than remaining static, machine gun teams frequently displaced forward or laterally to exploit terrain advantages. The M1919's air-cooled design eliminated the logistical burden of carrying water for cooling, which had constrained earlier machine gun operations. This seemingly small change had enormous implications on the battlefield. Crews could operate independently for longer periods, reposition without resupply, and continue fighting even when cut off from immediate support. The Battle of the Bulge again underscored these advantages. As German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, American units found themselves fighting in freezing temperatures, limited visibility, and chaotic conditions. Machine gun crews often became the last line of defense, holding road junctions, village edges, and forest clearings against numerically superior forces. The M1919's ability to function in extreme cold made it a critical asset. Properly maintained, it continued to cycle rounds even as other weapons failed or froze. German soldiers attacking American positions during the Bulge frequently encountered layered defenses anchored by machine guns. The M1919's sustained fire allowed defenders to break up assaults before they reached grenade range. In many cases, attackers were forced to withdraw after suffering heavy casualties without ever closing with the defenders. These defensive successes bought time for reinforcements to arrive and for Allied commanders to stabilize the front. The machine gun did not merely kill, it delayed, disrupted, and demoralized. Captured German reports and post-war accounts often mention the difficulty of advancing against American positions defended by multiple machine guns. While the MG-42 remained feared for its high rate of fire, German troops recognized that American machine guns seemed to fire endlessly and rarely stopped due to malfunction. This perception mattered. The belief that a weapon would not fail under pressure shaped how soldiers approached combat. For American crews, confidence in the M1919 reduced hesitation and increased willingness to hold exposed positions under fire. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in early 1945, the nature of combat shifted toward urban warfare and fortified defensive belts. German cities presented new challenges, with rubble-filled streets, collapsed buildings, and narrow alleys creating countless ambush points. The M1919 adapted easily to these conditions. Machine gun teams positioned themselves to dominate intersections and long sight lines, preventing German units from maneuvering freely. Even when German defenders attempted to use Panzerfausts or close-range assaults, sustained machine gun fire often broke attacks before they could be executed. In vehicle-mounted roles, the M1919 continued to prove indispensable. Tank crews relied heavily on coaxial and externally mounted Brownings to deal with infantry threats in urban environments, where main guns were often ineffective or dangerous to use. Half-tracks equipped with M1919s became mobile fire bases, providing immediate suppressive fire wherever resistance was encountered. The gun's consistent performance across different mounting configurations underscored its versatility and robust design. By the time Allied forces were fighting deep inside Germany, the M1919 had become so familiar to American troops that its presence was almost taken for granted. New replacements quickly learned its operation, while veterans treated it as an old and trusted companion. This familiarity reduced training time and allowed units to maintain combat effectiveness even as casualties mounted. The gun's simple, proven design ensured that it could be kept in service with minimal tools and spare parts. As German resistance collapsed in the final months of the war, the M1919 remained in constant use, clearing pockets of resistance and enforcing control over captured territory. Even in the final battles, when German units were short on ammunition and manpower, the American machine gun continued to dominate engagements through sheer consistency. The weapon that had landed in Normandy nearly a year earlier was still doing its job as reliably as ever. The M1919 did not end the war by itself, but it made victory possible at the small unit level where wars are ultimately decided. It enabled movement, enforced control, and provided the sustained firepower that allowed American forces to fight through some of the most demanding combat conditions of the 20th century. As the war drew to a close, the reputation of the Browning M1919 was firmly established, not as a weapon of spectacle, but as the dependable workhorse that had carried American infantry from the beaches of France to the heart of Germany. Beyond its tactical value on the battlefield, the Browning M1919 owed much of its success to the philosophy behind its design. John Moses Browning had always believed that a weapon meant for war must be simple, rugged, and forgiving of human error. The M1919 reflected this mindset in every aspect of its construction. Its internal mechanism was straightforward, with fewer delicate parts than many contemporary machine guns, and its tolerances allowed it to continue functioning even when fouled by dirt, carbon buildup, or debris. For soldiers fighting in the unpredictable conditions of Europe, this mechanical resilience was often the difference between holding a position and being overrun. Training with the M1919 emphasized discipline and teamwork rather than individual marksmanship. Crews learned to control their rate of fire, coordinate barrel changes when necessary, and maintain situational awareness even during prolonged engagements. Unlike lighter automatic weapons that encourage short, aggressive bursts, the M1919 was built for sustained fire that shaped the battlefield over time. Gunners were taught to fire deliberately, adjusting elevation and traverse to sweep enemy positions, and deny movement rather than simply aiming for visible targets. This approach made the machine gun a force multiplier, capable of influencing an engagement far beyond the number of men behind it. American infantry units increasingly integrated the M1919 into their standard operating procedures as the war progressed. Platoon commanders learned to sight machine guns before engagements whenever possible, selecting positions that offered long fields of fire and natural cover. In defensive situations, overlapping machine gun coverage created interlocking kill zones that German attackers found extremely difficult to penetrate. Even when German units attempted to bypass these zones, the flexibility of American fire teams allowed M1919 crews to shift positions and re-establish control quickly. The gun's performance against German infantry was particularly notable during assaults supported by armor. While the M1919 could not reliably penetrate the armor of tanks, it was devastating against accompanying infantry, engineers, and anti-tank teams. German panzer operations depended heavily on close infantry support to protect vehicles from enemy soldiers armed with explosives or anti-tank weapons. By suppressing or eliminating this support, M1919 crews indirectly neutralized armored threats. Tank advances stalled when infantry could not move, and stalled tanks became vulnerable to American anti-tank guns and aircraft. This indirect impact on armored warfare gave the M1919 an importance that went far beyond its classification as a medium machine gun. It did not destroy tanks, but it shaped the conditions under which tanks could operate. German after-action reports frequently noted the difficulty of coordinating infantry movements under sustained American machine gun fire. The consistent presence of M1919s forced attackers to rely more heavily on artillery preparation, slowing the tempo of operations and reducing opportunities for surprise. Captured German weapons and post-war analysis also revealed an unintended complement to the Browning design. While German engineers admired the high rate of fire and quick-change barrel of the MG42, they recognized that its complexity came at a cost. The MG42 demanded a steady supply of spare barrels and careful maintenance to avoid overheating and malfunctions. In contrast, the M1919's lower rate of fire and robust barrel design allowed it to operate effectively without constant intervention. American crews could fire thousands of rounds in a single engagement with minimal downtime, an advantage that became increasingly important as supply lines stretched and battlefield conditions deteriorated. The reliability of the M1919 also influenced American morale in subtle but significant ways. Soldiers who trusted their weapons were more willing to hold exposed positions, advance under fire, and maintain cohesion during chaotic engagements. Veterans often recalled that knowing a machine gun would continue firing no matter the conditions gave them confidence even when surrounded or outnumbered. This psychological effect was difficult to quantify, but undeniably real. In contrast, weapons that jammed or failed under pressure eroded trust and increased hesitation at critical moments. As American forces advanced into Germany, they encountered increasingly desperate resistance. Many German units consisted of a mix of experienced veterans and poorly trained replacements, armed with whatever weapons were available. In these engagements, the M1919 often faced enemy troops equipped with captured weapons, improvised defenses, and limited ammunition. The machine gun's ability to dominate space and deny movement proved decisive. German defenders frequently abandoned positions once American machine guns were brought to bear, recognizing that continued resistance would only result in mounting casualties. Urban combat further highlighted the M1919's adaptability. Streets, corridors, and ruined buildings created natural firing lanes that machine gun teams exploited with deadly efficiency. Gunners positioned themselves to cover long stretches of road or rubble-choked alleys, firing into likely avenues of approach while remaining protected by walls or debris. Even when German troops attempted close-range assaults, the volume of fire produced by the M1919 often broke attacks before they could develop. The weapon's controllability allowed gunners to adjust fire rapidly as threats emerged from multiple directions. In vehicle-mounted roles, the M1919 continued to earn the respect of those who depended on it. Tank crews frequently described the coaxial Browning as their primary defense against infantry, especially in close terrain. While the main gun handled enemy armor and fortifications, the machine gun dealt with soldiers armed with Panzerfausts or anti-tank grenades. The consistent performance of the M1919 under vibration, dust, and recoil reinforced its reputation as a weapon that could be trusted in any role. By 1945, the M1919 had become one of the most widely used American weapons of the war, with hundreds of thousands produced and deployed across multiple theaters. Though it also saw service in the Pacific, its impact in Europe was particularly pronounced due to the nature of ground combat there. Long advances, defensive battles, and combined arms operations all relied on sustained firepower, and the M1919 delivered exactly that. It was not a weapon of innovation, but of execution, translating doctrine into battlefield reality. As the final battles of the European War unfolded, the Browning M1919 remained present at nearly every level of combat. From holding roadblocks against last-ditch counterattacks to suppressing isolated pockets of resistance, it continued to perform the same task it had since Normandy. The gun did not change as the war progressed. The war changed around it. In doing so, the M1919 proved that reliability, simplicity, and sustained firepower were often more valuable than speed or novelty. Its quiet effectiveness ensured that it would be remembered not as a symbol of terror or spectacle, but as the dependable instrument that allowed American soldiers to advance, survive, and ultimately prevail. As Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany in early 1945, the Browning M1919 became increasingly central to the grinding, close-range nature of the fighting. The wide-open maneuver warfare of France had given way to dense urban centers, river crossings, and fortified defensive belts where German units fought from rubble, cellars, and hastily prepared strongpoints. In this environment, the machine gun was no longer simply suppressing enemy movement at distance. It was shaping every step of the advance, determining where soldiers could move, where they could pause, and where they would be forced to fight. American infantry units learned to use the M1919 as both a shield and a spear. During assaults on towns and cities, machine gun teams established base of fire positions that allowed rifle squads to advance from building to building. The gun's steady rate of fire enabled gunners to maintain pressure on enemy positions without exhausting ammunition too quickly, a critical factor when resupply was uncertain or delayed. German defenders, often operating with limited ammunition and increasingly inexperienced personnel, struggled to counter the continuous suppressive fire that prevented them from repositioning or organizing effective counterattacks. River crossings represented some of the most dangerous operations of the late war, and here again the M1919 proved indispensable. As American forces approached the Rhine and its tributaries, German units attempted to defend crossing points with concentrated fire from machine guns, artillery, and small arms. To establish bridgeheads, American infantry relied heavily on machine gun fire to suppress defenders on the far bank. M1919 crews often fired continuously during these operations, covering engineers and assault troops as they crossed under fire. The gun's reliability under prolonged use made it possible to maintain this protective fire even as barrels heated and conditions deteriorated. The crossing of the Rhine itself marked a turning point, but it did not signal the end of hard fighting. German resistance, though fragmented, remained fierce in many areas. The M1919 continued to anchor defensive perimeters around newly captured positions, preventing counterattacks while American forces consolidated their gains. In villages and industrial zones, machine gun teams dominated long streets and factory corridors, using the gun's sustained fire to deny movement and isolate defenders. These actions reduced casualties among advancing troops and shortened engagements that might otherwise have dragged on for days. Captured German soldiers frequently remarked on the effectiveness of American machine gun fire, while propaganda often emphasized the supposed superiority of German weapons. The reality on the ground told a different story. Many German units encountered American positions where machine guns fired steadily for hours without interruption. This consistency eroded morale and reinforced the sense that resistance was increasingly futile. The M1919 did not inspire fear through sound alone, as the MG42 did, but through the relentless certainty of its fire. By this stage of the war, American machine gun crews were highly experienced. Many had been fighting since Normandy or even earlier campaigns, and their understanding of terrain, timing, and coordination had matured. They knew when to fire continuously, and when to conserve ammunition, when to reposition, and when to hold ground at all costs. The M1919's design supported this experience rather than complicating it. There were no complex procedures or fragile components to manage under stress. The gun responded predictably to trained hands, reinforcing the professionalism of the crews who operated it. The weapon's adaptability also extended to its logistical footprint. Ammunition for the M1919 was plentiful, standardized, and compatible with other American small arms. This simplified resupply and reduced the likelihood of shortages at critical moments. In contrast, German units increasingly faced ammunition scarcity and compatibility issues as the war dragged on. American machine gun teams rarely worried about whether the next belt would fit or function. This logistical reliability translated directly into battlefield effectiveness. As Allied forces reached the outskirts of major German cities, including those that would eventually fall within the Soviet zone, the M1919 continued to be used aggressively. Urban combat demanded constant suppression of windows, rooftops, and street-level firing points. Machine gun teams often operated in coordination with armor, firing ahead of advancing tanks to clear infantry threats and protect vulnerable flanks. In these combined arms actions, the M1919 once again proved its value as a bridge between infantry and armor, enabling coordinated advances through hostile terrain. Even in the final weeks of the war, when German resistance was collapsing unevenly across the front, American units encountered pockets of determined defenders. Fanatical units, SS remnants, and isolated formations sometimes fought fiercely despite the hopelessness of their situation. In these encounters, the M1919 remained the weapon of choice for breaking resistance without unnecessary risk. Sustained machine gun fire forced defenders to surrender or withdraw, minimizing the need for costly close-quarters assaults. By the time the fighting reached its conclusion, the Browning M1919 had been present in nearly every major phase of the European campaign. It had landed on the beaches of Normandy, fought through the hedgerows of France, held the line during the Battle of the Bulge, crossed the Rhine, and advanced into the heart of Germany. Few weapons could claim such a continuous and decisive presence. Its impact was not measured in dramatic single moments, but in countless engagements where its steady fire made success possible. As the guns fell silent and American soldiers began the long process of occupation and demobilization, the M1919 remained in service, guarding checkpoints, securing facilities, and maintaining order in a defeated nation. The same qualities that made it effective in combat, reliability, simplicity, and sustained firepower, made it well suited for these post-war tasks. It was a weapon that adapted easily to changing roles, just as it had adapted to changing battlefields. The story of the M1919 in Europe is not one of innovation or spectacle, but of execution and endurance. It did not rely on revolutionary features or extreme performance metrics. Instead, it delivered consistent results under conditions that broke more complex systems. In doing so, it exemplified the American approach to warfare during World War II. Overwhelming force applied reliably, relentlessly, and with discipline. As the war ended and attention shifted to reconstruction and remembrance, the Browning M1919 quietly took its place among the most important weapons of the conflict, not because it was the loudest or fastest, but because it never failed when it mattered most. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the Browning M1919 had become something more than a machine gun. It was a symbol of how American infantry fought and survived in a brutal, industrialized war that rewarded reliability over brilliance and endurance over spectacle. Long after the last shots were fired, veterans remembered the weapon not as a marvel of engineering, but as a dependable presence that stood between them and enemy fire when everything else seemed uncertain. Unlike many wartime weapons that were quickly retired or replaced, the M1919 continued to serve for decades. Its design proved so solid that it required little modification to remain effective in the post-war world. The same characteristics that made it valuable in Normandy and the Ardennes, simple mechanics, manageable weight, and sustained fire, ensured its relevance during the early Cold War. American forces carried it into Korea, where freezing temperatures and rugged terrain once again tested the reliability of infantry weapons. Just as it had in Europe, the M1919 functioned when conditions were at their worst. In Korea, machine gun teams relied on the M1919 to defend hilltop positions against massed infantry assaults. The terrain and climate echoed the challenges faced in Europe, and once again the gun's performance validated its design. While newer weapons entered service, the M1919 remained trusted by the men who carried it. Many veterans of the Korean War later remarked that the gun felt unchanged from its World War II predecessor, a continuity that reinforced confidence in its effectiveness. Beyond the battlefield, the M1919 left a lasting imprint on military doctrine. Its role in squad and platoon tactics helped shape how American infantry units were structured and trained. The emphasis on sustained suppressive fire became a core principle of U.S. infantry operations, influencing the development of later machine guns such as the M60 and, eventually, the M240. While these newer weapons offered improvements in caliber or portability, they inherited the fundamental lessons learned from the M1919 service. Reliability and controllability mattered more than raw firepower. The legacy of the M1919 is also preserved in the countless photographs and combat reports from World War II. In images of Normandy hedgerows, ruined German towns, and frozen forests, the silhouette of the Browning machine gun appears again and again. It is often seen mounted on tripods, resting on sandbags, or slung across vehicles, a constant companion to American soldiers advancing across Europe. These images are not staged or ceremonial. They are snapshots of a weapon in daily use, integrated into the fabric of combat. Captured examples of the M1919 found their way into German hands during the war, where they were often pressed into service due to their dependability. German soldiers, familiar with the strengths and weaknesses of their own machine guns, quickly recognized the value of the Browning. This quiet acknowledgement from the enemy further underscored the weapon's effectiveness. It was a rare instance where practicality overcame ideology on the battlefield. For the men who carried it, the M1919 represented teamwork as much as technology. Operating the gun required coordination between the gunner, assistant gunner, and ammunition bearer. Each member of the team depended on the others to keep the weapon functioning and the position secure. This shared responsibility forged bonds that lasted long after the war ended. Veterans often spoke of the machine gun crew as a family within the larger unit, bound by the shared burden of maintaining the gun under fire. As the decades passed, the M1919 gradually transitioned from frontline service to training grounds, museums, and private collections. Historians and collectors came to appreciate its craftsmanship and historical significance. Unlike more exotic weapons, the Browning's appeal lay in its straightforward design and proven performance. It represented a philosophy of warfare that valued practicality and reliability above all else. In modern military history, the M1919 is often overshadowed by more famous weapons, but its influence remains undeniable. It shaped how American infantry fought in World War II and set standards that continue to inform weapon design today. Its presence on battlefields from Normandy to Berlin was not coincidental. It was the result of careful engineering matched with disciplined training and effective doctrine. The story of the M1919 is ultimately the story of the soldiers who used it. It is a story of long hours spent digging in, setting up tripods, feeding belts, and waiting under fire. It is a story of holding ground against overwhelming odds, of providing cover for advancing comrades, and of surviving in conditions that tested both body and mind. The machine gun did not win the war by itself, but it enabled the men who did. As World War II recedes further into history, the Browning M1919 stands as a reminder that victory is often achieved not through revolutionary ideas, but through reliable tools used with skill and determination. It was never glamorous, never experimental, and never temperamental. It did exactly what it was designed to do, every time it was needed. From the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Berlin, the M1919 earned its reputation not through legend, but through performance. In the hands of American infantry, it became one of the most important weapons of the European war, an unassuming workhorse that helped carry an army across a continent and into history.